Live from London, this is BBC News. Desperately needed aid is dropped into Gaza as Donald Trump's Middle East envoy meets Benjamin Netanyahu. At least 11 people, including a 6-year-old boy, are killed in the latest wave of Russian attacks on Ukraine. The former mixed martial arts fighter Conor McGregor loses his appeal in a civil case where he was accused of rape. A man is arrested on suspicion of administering poison after children fall ill at a summer camp in Leicestershire. And every parent's dilemma, the perils of screen time. But we'll hear from one expert who says the dangers may be overblown. Hello, I'm Anita McVeigh and welcome to Verified Live. President Trump's special envoy, Steve Witkoff, is in Israel for talks about the humanitarian crisis in Gaza and to try to revive stalled peace talks. He's been meeting Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu days after President Trump spoke about images of starvation inside Gaza. It's thought Mr. Witkoff may visit controversial aid distribution sites run by the US Israel-backed Gaza Humanitarian Foundation. The visit began as international pressure on Israel grows, with another country announcing it's considering recognizing a Palestinian state in September. The Portuguese government said it would consult the country's president and parliament on the question. And the German foreign minister has also called for negotiations on a two-state solution to begin immediately. In the last 24 hours, Canada has also announced plans to recognize a state of Palestine, following France and the UK. And President Trump has been reacting to Canada's announcement. In a post on his social network, Truth Social, he wrote, "Wow, Canada has just announced that it is backing statehood for Palestine. He said that will make it very hard for us to make a trade deal with them. Oh, Canada," he said, echoing the name of Canada's national anthem. And in the last hour, the United States has said it will start denying visas to officials from the Palestinian Authority. The State Department said the PA and the body that represents it on the international stage, the Palestine Liberation Organization, were supporting terrorism and undermining the prospects for peace. Our correspondent John Donison in Jerusalem has the latest on that meeting between Steve Witkoff and the Israeli Prime Minister.
All we've had is a couple of still photographs of the two men shaking hands, and then they've been in talks now for several hours, but no further details. Now, in terms of those negotiations between Hamas and Israel that you mentioned, it's quite difficult to know what Mr. Witkoff will say to Mr. Netanyahu, because when those negotiations broke down again last week, the White House said the blame was squarely on Hamas. So unless Mr. Witkoff is going to say something different to Mr. Netanyahu, we can only assume that he's going to say, well, look, America's got your back. So I think the focus of these talks today is much more likely going to be on the desperate aid situation in Gaza. You mentioned Mr. Trump talking of real starvation in Gaza for the first time. And just in the last 24 hours, according to the health ministry in Gaza, more than 100 people killed, 90 of them trying to get access to aid.
And it's thought, John, isn't it, that Steve Witkoff will visit a number of sites of that controversial Gaza Humanitarian Foundation. We're now hearing also that a US doctor has invited Mr. Witkoff to come to the Nasser Hospital in southern Gaza to see for himself conditions there.
Yeah, this is Dr. Thomas Adamkiewicz, and he spoke to my colleague Yolan Nell. He had volunteered at the Nasser Hospital in southern Gaza. He said that children were starving to death there, and he invited Mr. Witkoff to go along and see for himself. Now, that will probably be quite close to where Mr. Witkoff may visit some of those GHF aid distribution centres, but I do think it's extremely unlikely that the Israelis will allow him to go and visit that hospital. In fact, as far as I know, he's not going to be speaking to any Palestinians on this visit.
John Donison reporting. In the past few hours, Jordan and the United Arab Emirates have been carrying out more airdrops of aid over Gaza. These are the latest pictures from there. The Health Ministry says 91 people have been killed while seeking aid in the past day, and at least 2 more people have died from malnutrition in the last 24 hours, bringing the number of hunger-related deaths since the start of the war to 159. Khan Yunis-based journalist Mahmoud Rostom spoke to me a little earlier about what daily life is like in Gaza.
Actually, I made a tour last week to see how is the situation at the north of Gaza, and I was shocked with what I saw because, you know, Israel last days says that there will be a temporary ceasefire from 8 a.m. until from 10 a.m. until 8 p.m. We keep losing victims. The civilians are going to get humanitarian aids from Zekim, from Nabulsi, and they are being killed there. Lots of witnesses told me that they were very close to die. Lots of people died behind them. Also, I have my relative who went to Zekim. He told me that he was near to trucks and he collected some aids. And while he was collecting, the IDF soldiers came to him and killed a random guy behind him and told him to leave the aids that he collected and to hold that guy and to go back to Gaza. And he was shocked until now. He went to home, he was full bloody, and I think this is a misleading for the world from Israel. You know, there is no ceasefire. We keep here bombing all the day. Also, before that ceasefire beginning, yesterday I couldn't sleep because of hard bombing. I can see that the market, we have some of the aids that coming. The mafia here keep stealing that food and sell it at the market with a very high price. I think this criteria was done. It was mean by Israel to let the Palestinians suffering here in Gaza.
Mahmoud Rostom. Well, let's speak now to Jasmine El-Gamal, former Middle East advisor with the U.S. Department of Defense in the Obama administration. Thank you very much for joining us on the program today. I'm just seeing from our colleagues in Washington that Marjorie Taylor Greene, a key MAGA voice in the U.S., has been talking further about the aid situation in Gaza. She has done in the last few days, and now in a post on X a short time ago, she says that children are starving, and adding that Christians have been killed and injured in Gaza as well. She said this should be absolutely unacceptable, just as we said that Hamas killing and kidnapping innocent people on October the 7th is absolutely unacceptable. What do you think this pressure from key voices like her in President Trump's MAGA base might have on the US decision-making in terms of what happens next?
Thank you so much for having me, first of all. I mean, these voices have been, as you said, increasingly loud over the last few months. You have people like Marjorie Taylor Greene, you have people like Tucker Carlson, former Congressman Matt Gaetz. These are all really loud and consistent, loyal supporters of President Trump who have been voicing their concerns and saying, this doesn't make any sense. What we're seeing doesn't make sense. The loss of life, the starvation, the fact that we are aiding and abetting in all of this as Americans using American taxpayer money and weapons, it's not making sense and it needs to stop. So a big part of President Trump's base is really riled up about this. Besides the fact that, as you can see, the images, the stories that we're seeing and hearing coming out of Gaza these last few weeks especially, but of course over the course of 22 months now, I think have really transcended political parties and any kind of ideological sides. The vast majority of Americans now agree that this war needs to end, that the starvation needs to stop. Of course, the hostages need to come back home, and the U.S. needs to stop enabling Israel and supporting it unconditionally. So you see this massive shift happening in American public opinion, especially amongst younger people and amongst the MAGA base of Donald Trump. Whether or not that compels him to shift his policies, it remains unclear. We haven't seen that pressure translate into a real shift in terms of pressure on Israel yet.
And we have seen the Trump administration very squarely standing with Israel when a number of other countries, and a growing number of countries now, have indicated that they will recognize a Palestinian state at the UN General Assembly in the autumn, or are considering whether they will do that. But, you know, President Trump has said when he spoke in Scotland earlier this week, and he saw those images of starving children, and he said, you know, we're going to be even more involved. So do you think that pressure from the US on the aid situation on Israel will grow? And might that, as a consequence, have a knock-on effect on Israeli military action in the days and weeks ahead?
That's a really good question. It's a tough one to answer because these talks between Steve Witkoff and the Israelis have been fairly opaque. And of course, we're talking about President Trump here. It's really hard to discern what he's thinking about any given topic at any given time of the day. So all of those things make this a bit complicated to try to guess what is going to happen. But one can imagine that right now, because of the pressure that the Trump administration is getting from its own base, because of what it's hearing from other countries, I mean, you have all these countries now basically moving away from the US in a sense, saying we're not going to wait for the US to approve our policies on Palestine. We are going to move ahead with recognition or consideration of recognition. And there's a wall-to-wall consensus that this humanitarian crisis, that the horrors that we're seeing right now, the forced starvation, has to end. And so one can imagine Steve Witkoff definitely putting more pressure on the Israelis. He may be doing it behind the scenes. He won't want to show daylight between the US and Israel, particularly at this really critical moment in the negotiations. He's going to want to project unconditional US support for Israel as it tries to fulfill and end this negotiation process with Hamas. I'm not saying that's the best strategy, but I'm guessing that that's what the strategy is. So if there is pressure that he's going to be putting on Netanyahu, he's going to probably be doing it behind the scenes, saying, listen, this is not good for Israel. This is not good for your image. Your diplomatic standing is at an all-time low as a country. You're losing the narrative battle. You can imagine him saying all these things. And people are starving. This is not right. You have to do better. And that's probably why he's now going to watch and see what the Gaza so-called humanitarian foundation is doing. And I think that once he gets there, he may very well realize that this foundation is doing exactly the opposite of what it's meant to be doing. Rather than providing aid, it's actually making it harder and more dangerous for Palestinians to be fed. They're getting killed and shot at while they try to get this aid. So hopefully that'll change the strategy a little bit.
We're out of time, but Jasmine El-Gamal, thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.
Now, some breaking news related to President Trump as well. He has announced that he is postponing higher tariffs on Mexico for 90 days. We know that since he introduced these tariffs on, many countries, he and the Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum have had various conversations going back and forth. There have been some postponements at another period as well, a little earlier, a few months ago. But now President Trump saying that he is postponing higher tariffs on Mexico for 90 days. And of course, there is this rush to strike last-minute trade deals before President Trump's deadline of midnight on tariffs. He's been saying today that the tariffs will make America great and rich. So many of those levies due to go into effect very soon. We'll have more on that on Business Today later on this hour. So the latest line coming into us that tariff, that higher tariff on Mexico has been postponed by President Trump for a further 90 days. Now, 11 people have been killed and more than 130 wounded in a barrage of Russian drones and missiles that struck several districts of Kyiv and brought down an apartment block overnight. Ukrainian officials said Russia launched 8 cruise missiles and around 300 drones at Ukraine, with the capital the main target. The majority were shot down, but several buildings in the capital were still hit. The latest attacks happened despite renewed pressure from President Trump for Russia to end its attacks on Ukraine. Here are some residents of Kyiv describing what happened.
We
live across the street. I left my child with my husband and ran out into the street. From the balcony, I saw a woman lying in a pool of blood at 5 in the morning. We ran out into the street to help.
We went outside and saw a car on fire and explosions. It's impossible to describe. It's a shock. I still can't come to my senses, but it's very scary.
Let's speak now to photojournalist Patrick Yarich, who's photographed the aftermath of those missile attacks on Kyiv overnight. Patrick, thank you very much for joining us, and describe what you saw.
Well, basically, we see that there's increased capability of Russian to send way more drones than they used to. So now those attacks are way more intense and they last for almost whole night. So what I saw is basically a cruise missile strike in one of the neighborhoods, a residential neighborhood. And, it's just set cars on fire. Just a lot of elderly people leaving their homes in the middle of the night, and just basically narrowly escaping death, because that's what it is now for a lot of Kyiv residents. It's just some kind of roulette game of chance if they will survive or not. So the one missile strike scene that I was at, it just narrowly missed the building, maybe by 100 meters. And I spoke to some people that, it's just literally 100 meters if, they would survive or not. So a lot of them obviously were shocked and I guess glad to still be alive.
And what did that missile that you described, what did that actually hit?
I think it hit like a restaurant right next to the apartment building, it set a few cars on fire as well.
So are you seeing, as you go about your work, that more civilian buildings are being hit by these drones, these missiles that Russia is sending in?
Sometimes it seems very random. Like also today I saw on another scene, there was a drone strike that literally landed in in a pavement, basically, like a walk. So it just damaged a street, but it might as well be a building. So, today 11 people got killed because, like I said, this drone capability is increasing each month. And I think it won't get worse from here.
OK, Patrick Yarich, photojournalist, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Meanwhile, Ukraine's parliament has voted to re-establish the independence of the country's anti-corruption bodies, reversing a change which had been approved by President Zelensky. Those earlier changes meant the investigators would have had to answer to the office of the president. That triggered protests across the country, and MPs have now voted to restore independence to the investigators. Around the world and across the UK, this is BBC News. Conor McGregor has lost his appeal against the finding of a civil court jury that he sexually assaulted a woman. In November, the mixed martial arts fighter was ordered to pay £206,000 in damages and costs to Nikita Hand, who accused him of raping her in a hotel in Dublin in 2018. Earlier, I asked our Ireland correspondent Sarah Gervin to remind us of the background to the case.
Yeah, well, the background to this case was an allegation of rape from Nikita Hand, who you just heard from. at a hotel room, she said, in Dublin back in 2018. That led to a civil case at the High Court here in Dublin, where a jury found in that civil court late last year that she had been assaulted by Conor McGregor, and as you said, she was then awarded more than £200,000. Now, Conor McGregor had denied that rape, denied that sexual assault, and said that the sex that took place between them that evening was consensual. And then he launched his appeal on several legal grounds, but today a panel of 3 judges here at the Court of Appeal rejected that in its entirety. And as you said, we have just heard from a clearly very emotional Nikita Hand. She's been in court throughout the appeal proceedings and throughout those civil proceedings at the end of last year. Now, she talked about her painful journey. She said that the appeal had re-traumatised her again and again. And I think it's important for me to explain that Nikita Hand's civil case last year became a bit of a touchstone moment here in the Republic of Ireland for many survivors and victims of sexual abuse. Her coming out publicly against such a famous figure as Conor McGregor. Many charities told that they then experienced an influx of other women coming forward with their experiences. So you did hear her then use her platform there, telling the cameras again, where she addressed those victims and survivors, appealing to them, telling that they deserve justice and they deserve to have their stories told. And that's a message that she has given again and again throughout these court proceedings. But just to reiterate what has happened here today, Conor McGregor's appeal at the appeal court here in Dublin has been rejected in its entirety by a panel of 3 judges.
And legally, Sarah, is that an end to proceedings?
As we understand it, Anita, yes, it's unclear at this point whether Conor McGregor could take it to an even higher court. There was certainly no mention of that today. We just heard from the judges going through the legal points of his appeal and rejecting each one of them one by one. Then came the issue of damages. Those still stand. The damages that were awarded by that civil jury late last year of more than £200,000, and legal costs as well were awarded to Nikita Hand. And actually she got more legal costs awarded to her today because of the legal proceedings that she's had to be involved in because of this Court of Appeal case. So it is unclear at the moment if this will be referred again to a higher court. We've certainly had no indication of that at the moment. Nikita Hand will be very much hoping that this is an end to proceedings. As I said earlier, Conor McGregor was not in court here today. He does usually tend to post things on his X account on social media. There's been no reaction there today as yet, or from his legal counsel. So we're unclear just at the moment what his next steps may be, if there are any at all.
Our Ireland correspondent Sarah Gervin. It's a familiar battle for many parents, especially during the summer holidays. How much screen time should children have? One of the great fears for parents is that their children's brains are being rewired by an excessive use of screens. Now, a group of UK scientists claims that concrete scientific evidence on the downsides of screens is lacking. So have we got it wrong when it comes to worrying about our children and curbing their access to tablets and smartphones? Pete Etchells is a psychology and science communication professor at Bath Spa University. He told me that parents are conditioned to assume that too much screen time is harmful to children.
I think as parents, we naturally take a precautionary approach to anything to do with our children and their safety. And I think screen time is no different in that sense. What we have seen over the past 10 years or so and more is really a predominantly negative narrative about screens take hold that just isn't necessarily reflective of what we actually know from the scientific literature.
Oh, OK, so what evidence exactly is there? And are you saying emphatically that there needs to be more research, more study done into this? Because actually this issue of being concerned about too much screen time potentially has been around for quite a while now, hasn't it?
And I think that's actually one of the major problems, is that screen times are very easily understandable concept. We all understand it, and it's very enticing from a scientific point of view. But actually, it's fairly meaningless if what we want to try and do is deeply understand how different forms of screen time, different content, different contexts of use, what sorts of impacts they have, both positively and negatively. If we focus just on the sort of sheer amount of time, which is something that we have done for many years now, we get stuck in this cycle of doing not particularly good science, but still doing science. And then we get a massive literature of studies which seem to show that there's a link between screen time and various negative measures. But actually, they all have the same fundamental flaws at their basis. And the problem for us as parents and as policymakers and as clinicians and teachers is that that's not very helpful if what we actually want to do is unpack that relationship and try and figure out where the benefits lie and where the risks are.
Professor Pete Etchells. And if you want to read more on this, our technology editor Zoe Kleinman has written an in-depth piece which is on the BBC News website and app. Now, beds of clams, mats of bacteria that look like ice and fields of tube worms, just some of the extreme life that has been observed in the deepest parts of the ocean for the first time by a Chinese-led research team who've captured these images at depths of more than 9 kilometres. These animals living in the pitch dark. Fascinating to get an insight. Do stay with us here on BBC News. Some business news coming up for you next.
Now on BBC News, the latest business news from across the globe. Business Today.
The end of the road. The chief executive of Jaguar Land Rover is to step down after 35 years with the company. Welcome to the club. Microsoft joins Nvidia as the world's second $4 trillion company as big tech's AI gold rush drives the markets higher. And the final countdown, less than 24 hours until President Trump's tariff deadline. So who will get their trade deal over the line? We'll have the very latest. Hello, welcome to the programme. We start with news breaking this hour that the chief executive of Jaguar Land Rover has resigned. The company said that Adrian Mardell had expressed his desire to retire after 3 years as chief executive, 35 years at Jaguar Land Rover. Well, the British motor manufacturer has had a rather turbulent few months following a rather disastrous advertising campaign that critics claimed was excessively woke. So let's get the assessment of David Bailey, Professor of Business Economics at the University of Birmingham Business School. David, good to have you here. And what's your read on this? What's gone on?
Well, firstly, I am surprised he's going. He's done a fantastic job in terms of turning Jaguar Land Rover around. It was loss-making just under 3 years ago when he arrived, and they've just returned their best profits in over a decade, 2.5 billion profit earlier this year. So, he's done an amazing job, I think, in really turning the company around. Having said all of that, of course, they've just announced 500 job cuts. The impact of tariffs from the US going forwards is going to weigh on the firm, so things will be more difficult. And as you mentioned, there was that great controversy over the Jaguar rebranding, which was seen as having alienated many of its traditional buyers. So how that works out longer term, I think, is an open question.
Yes, and I suppose there's a question about whether he is the man to lead the company into its new era, a new era that is all electric.
Yes, I mean, they've kind of gone very early for Jaguar in terms of going all electric. They've actually postponed the launch of both the all-electric Jaguar and the Range Rover, waiting for demand for electric vehicles to pick up, because as we all know, it's not growing as quickly as anticipated. So that decision to go all electric for Jaguar has kind of left them slightly exposed. Having said all of that, they're still turning in bumper profits, even though they're not actually making any Jaguars at the moment. So it does show really how important the Range Rover and Defender brand is to the company.
Yeah, and that's what's so interesting here, David. We talk about that sort of, botch relaunch. Questions about whether it was, because the first thing it did was get a lot of eyeballs and a lot of attention, and that's a good thing. And you touched on it there. The problem is that they're sort of wanting customers to believe in a future without them actually delivering any cars for a few years. And they've got to say, stick with us. And it's not necessarily about turning their back on the old lot, but it's saying that you need to be patient if you want to see what we're working on.
Yes, I mean, the very divided views on that whole advertising campaign, marketing campaign around the new Jaguar concept car. As you said, it got people talking about Jaguar when they weren't actually making any Jaguar cars at all, and people are going to have to wait for it. So it did a good job in really raising interest in that brand and also trying to appeal to a completely new demographic. Let's face it, the brand as it was could not survive. It simply wasn't selling anywhere near enough cars, and it wasn't selling cars at a high enough premium. So it's shifting into the luxury space for the first time in its history. And I think that's why it's really interesting. Is this going to work? No guarantees on that one.
Yeah, fascinating, isn't it? We'll see how this plays out. But, I mean, you're quite right. It feels like if you've got to stand for something in this market, else you stand for nothing. David, always good to talk to you. Thank you, David Bailey there, University of Birmingham. Now, let's turn our attention to tech, because Microsoft has officially joined Nvidia in the $4 trillion valuation club. It marks a landmark moment in its history. Shares in Microsoft and Meta have been soaring over the past 24 hours after bumper results from both tech giants. Meta, that of course owns Facebook, Instagram and WhatsApp, says that profits jumped by 36% in the 3 months to the end of June. That comes as Mark Zuckerberg is putting big investments into AI. Now, investors think possibly that both companies have massive investments, and that is finally starting to pay off. Let's talk to Erin, who's standing by in New York. And Erin, that's the issue here, isn't it? All these tech firms piling this money in. And up until now, a lot of investors saying, what is this money buying us? What are we getting for it? But maybe it's now paying off.
Well, it's certainly coming across in a big, bold-faced headline today. Welcome to the club, Microsoft, joining that $4 trillion market cap club with NVIDIA, which became the first company to hit that marker earlier this month. Now, it's on the backs of some really strong earnings by Microsoft. We saw the company beat revenue expectations with its quarterly results. We saw revenue actually up 18%, and then that's the highest rate of growth in more than 3 years. It's on the back of the success of Azure and other cloud computing services here. You know, they reported that number in dollars for the first time, and it was a whopping number, more than $75 billion in annual revenue stemming to that. And that's actually up, as you said, more than a third from a year prior. So that's the big news on Microsoft today. But Ben, what you're alluding to here is the big AI boom, or maybe we should call it the AI arms race. You know, companies here are competing not just for products and success, but for talent. And two of the big companies that are reporting this week also, Apple and Meta, well, we've seen Meta come in and poach a lot of Apple's top AI talent in recent months now. And the concern is that Apple's falling a little bit behind. You know, that's the third largest company in market valuation, but the number is only around $3.2 trillion. It's not close to crossing that $4 trillion mark. This is the big move, the big investment. It's where everybody wants to be.
Yeah, and Aaron, briefly, I mean, that is the issue, isn't it? AI is such a game changer as far as these tech giants are concerned that it's enough to make or break their position in that top ranking. And anyone that's maybe caught napping on the job or not keeping up with the rapid pace of development stands to fall behind.
It's also part of why NVIDIA is leading the pack, because, Ben, NVIDIA makes the chips that are used to power these large language models, this generative AI push that all of the other companies in the Magnificent Seven are capitalizing on. So when we talk about these big tech firms building data centers all over the U.S. or all over the world, well, they're filling them with NVIDIA chips. That's why that company was the first to cross the $4 trillion mark. We haven't really seen yet what the full threshold of this power could be, how big it could be, but it has captured all of the excitement, all of the enthusiasm, and it has powered the market to big highs over recent months.
Aaron, good to talk to you. I know you'll keep an eye on that for us. Thank you. The Magnificent Seven. It sounds glorious, doesn't it? Big business in tech. Now, the clock is ticking with just over 12 hours to go until President Trump's August the 1st deadline for tariffs comes into force. In the last hour, the US president has said he's paused higher tariffs on Mexico for 90 days after a phone call with his counterpart, Claudia Sheinbaum. Still, aluminium and copper from Mexico will still be subject to a 50% tariff. Cars will face a 25% one. So let me run you through the latest announcements, because there's a lot of them. Brazil, the US president signed an executive order on Wednesday. That brings total tariffs on Brazilian goods imported into the US to 50%. President Trump also announced 25% tariffs on imports from India, but then later said actually they're still negotiating. And we also got an announcement of a trade deal with South Korea. That'll face 15% on anything that it sends to the US. Now that puts it on a par with deals that were sealed with Japan and the European Union. But one country that could miss out is Canada. That's after President Trump said that the Prime Minister Mark Carney's decision to recognise a Palestinian state could threaten a deal with America's biggest trading partner. So let's talk to Kaylin Birch, who's global economist at the Economist Intelligence Unit. Good to have you here. And look, there's so much just to talk about, this flurry of deals that's coming in before that deadline. But let's start first of all with Mexico, a key trading partner, but also one that's been in the sights of President Trump. He's postponing those tariffs for another 90 days. That is quite a significant change, and one that might get a deal over the line.
It is. It's quite a big deal, actually. And we had been thinking that actually the outlook for Canada and Mexico, while previously more or less tied closely together, had started to diverge a little bit. The US started to talk about different issues when they were mentioning the two kind of separate negotiations. And it seemed actually that Canada was closer to getting a deal. Mexico was in a really difficult position and seemed to not be able to offer anything new on the trade and immigration front that would have the U.S. back down of those initial tariffs that put in place for fentanyl and border security reasons. So this for Mexico is a big win. That 90-day window will allow for a lot of hopefully significant trade talks to continue.
I mean, people will be forgiven for being a bit confused about all of this, because every day there's another number, there's another percentage levied on another trading partner of the United States. You know, it feels like tariff bingo, doesn't it? But, you know, give me the sense of what President Trump is trying to do here. And crucially, I guess, whether he will achieve his aims.
That's a very good question. So first, what is he trying to do? I think we can identify a couple of common themes. And actually, as much as I may hate to say it, we saw a lot of that during the presidential campaign last year, and it started to really come to fruition. One of the main aims is revenue raising. And the reason we see that is that the US is putting relatively hefty tariffs on key trade partners that currently run a deficit with the US, so with whom the US has a surplus. If the US wanted to run down its goods trade deficit, it wouldn't be putting a 10% tariff on the UK, again, which has a deficit with the US. So the sign there is that the US is just looking to raise revenue across the board, and we've long known that Trump sees tariffs as a way to do that.
Yeah, and really briefly for us, I mean, there's so much still to play out here. We need to remember that businesses on both sides stand to suffer until there's any clarity.
Yeah, that's right. I think our initial view was that we might end up at a weighted average tariff rate for the US of around about 15%. And that implies a higher rate on China and a much lower rate between 10 and 20 on a lot of other economies. And it's looking like we're heading towards that kind of end point, but that masks a whole lot of uncertainty, stop-start negotiations, and big questions about where things are going to be in 6 months or 12 months' time, which ultimately just makes it very hard for businesses to plan.
Yeah, absolutely. Kayleen, good to talk to you. Thank you, Kayleen Boach there at the Economist Intelligence Unit. Now, air passengers suffered significant disruption yesterday after an air traffic control outage brought several major UK airports to a standstill. Thousands of planes grounded, including at London's Heathrow, which is Europe's busiest airport. Well, the airport has now been given the green light by the government to expand, and the deadline for competing proposals is today. Well, hotel tycoon Surinder Arora has announced he's submitting a rival expansion plan, and he explained why his should be given the go-ahead.
What we've been doing is we've been working with the best in class from planning point of view, from experience point of view, and I'm proud and delighted to be working with the likes of Bechtel. Bechtel have built and worked on nearly 200 airports around the world. Now, if they don't know about airports, I don't think there is anyone else that knows about airports. So what we're saying, and we've been working closely with the airlines, and that was the other difference, that when Heathrow came up with their plans back in 8-9 years ago, after the Davis Commission report, they didn't even consult the airlines fully. I remember asking the airlines, the regulator, the CAA, saying, were you consulted on the length of the runway? So we've always said, this is our view, our professional team's view. We're going to do everything we can possibly for us to grow as a nation. We want to make sure that we're not left behind. If you look at countries like India, who built 70 airports in the last 10 years, so we do need to do something to stay ahead of the game. We're here to work with the government. We're here to work with the airlines, our customers, and the regulator to make sure we deliver something that is going to be delivered on time, on budget, and something that will actually put us at the front of the queue.
And that is Your Business Today. Stay with us.
Every generation has to fight to maintain democracy.
There's a thrill in
not necessarily following a straight line, do you know what I mean? Trying things that are different.
Women are still judged by a different metric, and certainly judged by a different metric when they do something wrong.
I will continue on with a life of public service, so I will always support the charities and the people that mean so much to me.
When the big names talk, they talk to us.
Hello, I'm Anita McVeigh and you're watching Verified Live. The United Nations in Nigeria says it will today run out of money needed to continue supporting more than 1 million people displaced by militants. The Boko Haram group is considered one of the world's deadliest and has killed thousands of people across northern Nigeria, forcing tens of thousands more to flee and seek refuge in UN camps. But now the World Food Programme says cuts to global aid budgets, including by the United States, which was the biggest donor, could leave people hungry and force families back into the hands of the insurgents. Our Deputy Africa editor Anne Soy reports from Gwoza in northeastern Nigeria.
We are travelling with the UN to Gwoza. For aid workers, a helicopter is the only safe way in. This camp is home to thousands, surrounded by Boko Haram and the Islamic State. They've destroyed millions of lives. Aisha Abubakar lost her first husband and 6 children in the insurgency, forcing her to flee. She's now remarried and feels safer here.
I could not go back to the bush. My parents and my husband are here. Honestly, I cannot go back to the bush. Life in the bush is unbearable. We are always on the run.
Like all families here, Aisha's relies on humanitarian aid loaded to these debit cards, $20 for the family per month. But this is the last cash for food they'll receive. Funds have run out, and the UN fears that could force people into the arms of the militants.
It will be much easier for the militants to lure other youths to join them and spiral the insecurity across the whole region. And it might go trans-border because this is really a do or die situation.
The town is guarded by the Nigerian military. Insurgents could strike anytime. Millions of people across the northeast of Nigeria have fled to camps like this one, seeking safety, fleeing from militants. I'm told that here in Gwoza, the militants are located just beyond these hills. So the people around have fled here. They have found safety and support. And if that support is cut off, there are fears that it will leave them at the mercy of those militants. At health facilities, cuts are already real. The result? Spiking malnutrition rates. Almost half the camp's children are malnourished, including Hawa Badamasi's daughter, 3-year-old Amina. Clinics provide supplements, but could soon close.
We will be in a dire situation with no food and no medicine. Our survival depends on these essentials, and women often suffer the most in such circumstances, especially because they are responsible for nurturing children.
And there's no respite in sight. The US, by far the biggest donor, urges other nations to step up. For years, Nigeria has failed to tackle the insurgency. It has launched new efforts to fight malnutrition, but it's unclear if it can fill the gap. Aid has been a lifeline here. Officials fear its removal is a gift to the militants. Displaced families across northern Nigeria face an uncertain future. Anne Soy, BBC News, Gwoza.
Now we're going to show you what are probably some of the oldest tattoos in the world. High-resolution imaging has found them on a 2,500-year-old Siberian ice mummy. This image shows a tattoo of a rooster, which was discovered on the body of the woman, thought to be aged around 50. She's said to have come from a nomadic horse-riding people who lived in the Altai Mountains between China and Europe. Archaeologists say the discovery helps to shed light on ancient warrior culture. And take a look at this picture. It's of a lion and its prey, while this is an intricate griffin, a mythical half-lion, half-eagle creature. Well, traditional tattoo artist Daniel Riday worked with the archaeologists to try to figure out how the tattoos on the ice mummy were made. He explained what these tattoos will tell us about the people who made them.
This tattooing practice was an integral part of their culture. When we find these preserved human remains, often they are tattooed, and often those tattoos are not simple, easy to create images. The city and animal style, the style that these tattoos are in, is intricate and complex as a visual language in and of itself. And then to take that style and transform it into body markings would require the creation of specific tools and the mastery of those tools.
It may be 50 years old, but the thriller Jaws, the story of a great white shark terrorizing a New England beach community, based on a bestseller by author Peter Benchley, is still impressing audiences.
Love Jaws, very iconic, many great scenes, and it's a great summer movie.
It's fun to watch, it's just like high entertainment, and also just like the craft is like amazing. The cinematography is incredible.
To mark the 50th anniversary of Jaws, there are special TV presentations, a re-release of the film in cinemas, and a major forthcoming Jaws exhibition at the Academy Museum in Los Angeles, which big-name fans are promoting.
Jaws had such an impact in my life. That movie struck me to the core.
Still to this day, it makes me wonder what's lying underneath every time I'm swimming.
Hype may surround the Jaws anniversary, but to many, it is a truly great movie. At a New York diner, film critic Owen Gleiberman reflected on the legacy of Jaws. To him, the film's strength is that it respects reality.
What its legacy should be is movies should be based in reality, because that's what's so great about Jaws. You believe every minute of it. The genius of the young Steven Spielberg is that he staged this pulp shark thriller as if it was really happening, every moment of it.
You're gonna need a bigger boat.
Jaws is credited with launching the summer blockbuster, or more correctly, it created a new business model for Hollywood. The film was given a simultaneous release in hundreds of cinemas, almost unheard of at the time, and promoted relentlessly. It convinced studio executives that a lot of money could be made in the summer months if movies were released that way.
It just really changed the whole industry. Before Jaws, there wasn't really a well-defined summer movie season. You could have big movies coming out at any time of the year, but there was never a season that encapsulated what young people wanted to do in the summer, which was go to the movie theater, and it really changed everything.
Jaws broke new ground in other ways. It was the first major motion picture to be filmed on the ocean, and it ended up being a very troubled production because of the difficulties of shooting on water. Remarkably, Steven Spielberg was only 26 years old when he was directing the feature, and it was his second official film.
Roll sound.
In May 1974, when he was making Jaws, Steven Spielberg told a BBC film crew that taking on this major motion picture was a real challenge for him.
No, it doesn't come easily. I don't even think about it. If I thought about multi-million-dollar pictures and all the equipment and all the responsibility, I'd probably go bananas. This is my second day at sea, and I have 54 more days to go. And if I survive this, I'll have learned a lot, because right now, all I can tell you is it's twice as slow shooting at sea as it is shooting on land. Because when you set your camera for a shot, invariably the boat, which began here, is over here when you're ready to shoot.
You yell shark, we've got a panic on our hands on the 4th of July.
Jaws has left its mark. At the time of its release, it reduced beach attendance in the US because people feared being attacked by a shark. The film has also been criticised for its overly negative depictions of the great white shark as a ferocious, man-eating predator. And the movie's 50th anniversary in the US is perhaps making some older moviegoers nostalgic for a time when their country was less divided politically, and movies like Jaws had sufficient reach to bring everyone together under one big tent to enjoy being with one another and getting scared out of their wits.
Thousands of people have come here to the centre of Seoul this evening. They have come to celebrate the newly elected president, Lee Jae-myung.
He's been firing rubber bullets at the direction of the crowd, and it shows you just how volatile the situation is.
We're seeing scenes of destruction like this one across Mandalay, and the reality on the ground is there just aren't enough pairs of hands.
Given the scale of the attacks we've seen over the past 48 hours, it doesn't feel like we're in ceasefire territory.
There when the story breaks, BBC News.
Live from London, this is BBC News. Desperately needed aid is dropped into Gaza as Donald Trump's Middle East envoy meets Benjamin Netanyahu. At least 13 people, including a 6-year-old boy, are killed in the latest wave of Russian attacks on Ukraine. New figures show that more than 25,000 migrants have now crossed the channel in small boats this year. The former mixed martial arts fighter Conor McGregor loses his appeal in a civil case where he was accused of rape. A man is arrested on suspicion of administering poison after children fell ill at a summer camp in Leicestershire. And ready for liftoff, the next crew of the International Space Station prepares for launch in Florida. Hello, I'm Anita McVeigh, and this is Verified Live. President Trump's special envoy, Steve Witkoff, has met the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu in Jerusalem. Talks are believed to have included a renewed push to salvage stalled ceasefire talks and improving the humanitarian crisis in Gaza, as well as the return of hostages still held by Hamas. The meeting took place against the backdrop of increasing international pressure on Israel as Canada and Portugal have joined France and Britain in saying they will recognise or are considering recognising Palestinian statehood if the situation continues and certain conditions are met. Well, let's speak now to our State Department correspondent, Tom Bateman, who joins us from Washington. We haven't heard much directly out of Israel on this meeting between Steve Witkoff and Benjamin Netanyahu yet. What are you hearing there in Washington, Tom?
Well, it's significant that he has travelled to the region because there has been growing pressure on the Trump administration over the conditions in Gaza, over the fact that starvation is now gripping the territory. And President Trump had said in the UK earlier this week that there was, in his words, real starvation. And clearly it has been something that he has been pressed on. And so part of this visit will be around that. And it had been reported in the Israeli media that he would potentially visit one of the sites of the so-called Gaza Humanitarian Foundation. This is the organization established by the US and Israel, which operates inside Israeli military zones, that has seen this disastrous impact on the ground where aid seekers have been shot dead, according to eyewitnesses, by the Israeli military, and according to the UN, more than 1,000 people at least killed. And at the same time, we've seen, rampant malnutrition in the Gaza Strip over that period of time, and a lot of pressure on Israel. So I think what Mr. Witkoff reports back will be incredibly important, because he is a trusted voice as far as Mr. Trump is concerned. He's a former New York real estate mogul and a golfing partner of President Trump, who he put into this very high-profile international position, leading negotiations with the Russians and in the Middle East. But the point is, Mr. Trump trusts him, and I think what he says to him after this visit will therefore be extremely important in terms of what happens next.
And briefly, Tom, this new language coming from the US on aid and some pressure coming from prominent MAGA figures like Marjorie Taylor Greene calling for more aid to be brought into Gaza. Might that necessarily have a consequence for Israeli military action? Is the US going to end up putting pressure on Israel over that in order to get more aid in, do you think?
Well, I think the fact that Mr. Trump posted on his Truth Social network this morning, referencing the humanitarian crisis in the Gaza Strip, saying that it was down to Hamas to agree to a ceasefire deal that would, alleviate the suffering, was the implication. But the fact he is referencing it, I think, is very much meant for the intended audience being his MAGA base. I think he's very attuned to where the base is at on key issues. And I think that the fact that you have some key figures, an ultra-loyalist like Marjorie Taylor Greene, people like Tucker Carlson, that are really starting to talk about this, both using the word genocide in recent days, he will be very aware that that conversation is happening in his base. And I think what he's doing there is trying to say, look, this is all because of Hamas. They could fix the problem. But of course, his critics are saying it has been the US's unyielding support for the way that Israel has continued the war in Gaza that has led to this situation. So there is pressure on the administration, although its line on this has always been that the solution is getting a ceasefire and hostage release deal. The blame they put for that is on Hamas. Critics of Israel say that Mr. Netanyahu has continually changed the conditions, and that's another reason why they haven't got to this outcome. But at the same time, you have the State Department putting forward some punitive measures now against the Palestinian Authority, so the body that has limited self-governance in the West Bank, basically in response to the fact that this conference was held in New York, that countries are rallying around a potential two-state solution in terms of long-term peace, and some are recognizing a state of Palestine. The US has pushed back really hard on that, but and is by doing that now imposing some sanctions, travel bans on members of the Palestinian Authority.
OK, Tom, thank you very much. Tom Bateman. And in the past few hours, Jordan and the United Arab Emirates have been carrying out more airdrops of aid over Gaza. These latest pictures from there. And the Health Ministry says 91 people have been killed while seeking aid in the past day, with at least 2 more people dying from malnutrition in the last 24 hours, bringing the number of hunger-related deaths since the start of the war to 159. Khan Yunis-based journalist Mahmoud Rostam spoke to me about what daily life is like in Gaza.
Actually, I made a tour last week to see how is the situation at the north of Gaza, and I was shocked with what I saw, because, Israel last days says that there will be a temporary ceasefire from 8 a.m. until from 10 a.m. until 8 p.m. We keep losing victims. The civilians are going to get humanitarian aids from Zekim, from Al-Nabulsi, and they are being killed there. Lots of witnesses told me that they were very close to die. Lots of people died behind them. Also, I have my relative who went to Zekim. He told me that he was near to trucks and he collected some aids. And while he was collecting, the IDF soldiers came to him and killed a random guy behind him and told him to leave the aids that he collected and to hold that guy and to go back to Gaza. And he was shocked until now. He went to home, he was full bloody, and I think this is a misleading for the world from Israel. There is no ceasefire. We keep here bombing all the day. Also, before that ceasefire beginning, yesterday I couldn't sleep because of hard bombing. I can see that the market, we have some of the aids that coming. The mafia here keep stealing that food and sell it at the market with a very high price. I think this criteria was done. It was mean by Israel to let the Palestinians suffering here in Gaza.
Mahmoud Rostam. Now we're going to take you live to Florida because in less than 60 seconds now we are anticipating the launch of this rocket to meet the International Space Station. 12:09 local time. It has to be very precise because the crew on board need to align with the ISS. And this is the 12th astronaut launch by SpaceX for NASA on a SpaceX Dragon spacecraft powered by a Falcon 9 rocket. So getting very close to this happening by the looks of things. And let's just listen in because we should be hearing from the control room any second now. And nothing from the control room. We've been doing our own countdown here in the gallery. The team in the gallery have been doing the countdown, but nothing from the control room and no launch yet. I think we might still be in the window though. So as I say, this is the 12th astronaut launch by SpaceX for NASA. One of the astronauts, a crew of 4, Zena Cardman, this is her first space flight. She was due to go into space last year, but had to make room for the return of, and you may remember these names, Butch Wilmore and Sunita Williams, whose Starliner spacecraft malfunctioned, ending up with them spending longer in space than they planned to. Let's listen in now.
With that, you are go to proceed to 5.100 for launch scrub. We'll begin offloading the rocket.
Dragon copies all 5.100. Too bad, but we'll be ready next time.
So we're at 12:10 local time. So a little tolerance, I guess, perhaps, in the timing of this launch. And it looks like just waiting to hear if this launch is actually going ahead. So this is a crew of 4 heading for the International Space Station.
Call up to the crew that unfortunately the weather just not playing
there you go.
alongside with today's excitement of a launch for NASA SpaceX's Crew 11. But we have mentioned a couple times throughout the broadcast today that there are backup opportunities starting as early as tomorrow. 11:43 a.m. Eastern time is what the target time is for tomorrow's next attempt for launch for Crew 11, but it came right down to the wire, Soumya, with that T-minus 1 minute. But you heard on the loops there that it was just clipped, as they said, by a cumulus cloud to violate the weather rule. So unfortunately, today's launch attempt has been scrubbed due to weather.
Okay, well, you heard it there. This launch bedeviled by the weather. As often happens with rocket launches, the conditions have to be absolutely perfect. So they will have another attempt at this, likely tomorrow, in order to allow that crew of 4 to dock with the International Space Station, due to spend 6 to 8 months on the ISS. And one can only imagine what it's like for the crew to be less than 60 seconds from launch and bracing for that moment and then being told that actually it won't happen as planned today. I guess they prepare for that very scenario. So we'll try and bring that rocket launch to you when it does eventually happen.
And look back at everything.
Now, 13 people have been killed and more than 130 wounded in a barrage of Russian drones and missiles that struck several districts of Kyiv and brought down an apartment block overnight. Ukrainian officials said Russia launched 8 cruise missiles and around 300 drones at Ukraine, with the capital the main target. The majority were shot down, but several buildings in the capital were still hit. The latest attacks happened despite renewed pressure from President Trump for Russia to end its attacks on Ukraine. Meanwhile, Ukraine's parliament has voted to re-establish the independence of the country's anti-corruption bodies, reversing a change which had been approved by President Zelensky. Those earlier changes meant the investigators would have had to answer to the office of the president. That triggered protests across the country, and MPs have now voted to restore independence to the investigators. Well, let's speak to Vitaly Shevchenko, Russia editor from BBC Monitoring. Vitaly, thanks for joining me in the studio. Let's begin with those strikes overnight, mainly focusing on Kyiv. And we've seen this sort of pattern in recent weeks from Russia, haven't we? Lots of cruise missiles, lots of drones directed at targets in Ukraine. And many commentators saying, you know, this is a very obvious response from Russia to President Trump's deadline to stop the fighting, to stop the attacks.
It doesn't look like Russia is taking any of those deadlines seriously. Russia's aerial attacks are becoming more lethal, and there's a pattern emerging. First, Russia sends in wave after wave of drones, and they're becoming more sophisticated. Last night, a number of jet-powered drones were apparently deployed by Russia, and these drones are then followed by missiles. And it's the missiles that cause the most damage. We saw part of a 9-story apartment block collapse in Kyiv. And it's not just Kyiv, even though the Ukrainian capital was the focus of last night's Russian attack. In Kramatorsk, in eastern Donetsk region, another building, 5-story apartment block, was also hit by Russia, killing 1 person and injuring 11. Among the dead in Kyiv, there's a 6-year-old boy. The mayor of Kyiv, Vitaly Klitschko, says that last night saw the highest number of children wounded in a single nightly Russian attack, 9 children. So these attacks continue, and it does appear that there's a message from the Kremlin addressed to Donald Trump: no, we don't really care about your deadlines.
And just briefly on that particular point, Vitaly, you know, if President Trump is to introduce these further measures on Russia, including what the US would call the third parties, those countries that allow Russia in a way to get around some of the existing sanctions, you know, would that make a difference to the capacity of Russia to produce these missiles and these drones that it's attacking Ukraine with?
Well, a third of Russia's state revenue comes from selling hydrocarbons, oil and gas mainly. And currently it's China and India that are buying most of Russian oil and gas. If Donald Trump does introduce these secondary sanctions, it will be really interesting to see if China and India stop buying Russian oil. And then if they do, this will obviously impact, well, pretty much anything that Russia is able to do in Ukraine and manufacture new weapons as well.
OK, Vitaly, thank you very much. Vitaly Shevchenko. Around the world and across the UK, this is BBC News.